Ryan Carter had spent years building his private farm into a quiet place where he could work without interference. One morning, he heard vehicles approaching his locked front gate. When he stepped outside, he saw several sheriff's vehicles and Eleanor Whitmore standing beside the entrance. Eleanor smiled and told Ryan she was conducting a surprise HOA property inspection. Ryan looked at the lock gate and reminded her that the farm was private property. She replied that the HOA board had approved the inspection. Ryan asked Eleanor to show him the written notice required for an inspection. She laughed and said the HOA did not need to warn him because the inspection was an emergency. Ryan immediately asked what emergency she was talking about. Eleanor pointed toward the cattle pasture and claimed there had been a complaint about unsafe livestock fencing. Ryan looked at the fence and said it had been inspected only days earlier. He asked her who had filed the complaint. Eleanor refused to name the person who had complained. Ryan told her that he was willing to cooperate with legitimate authorities, but the HOA could not simply walk onto his land whenever it wanted. The sheriff looked toward Eleanor as if waiting for her to explain the legal basis for the inspection. Eleanor finally told the sheriff that the HOA had authority to inspect every property in the community. Ryan asked her to point to that authority in the HOA documents. She opened her folder but could not immediately find anything that covered his private farm. Ryan noticed one of the deputies looking at the lock gate and the posted private property sign. The deputy quietly told the sheriff that the gate appeared to be clearly marked and secured. Eleanor became visibly irritated that the officers were questioning her instead of Ryan. Eleanor stepped closer to the gate and insisted that Ryan open it immediately. Ryan calmly refused and said he would not obstruct a lawful investigation, but he needed to know what law was being enforced. The sheriff nodded and asked Eleanor to clarify the exact violation. Eleanor finally said the HOA suspected Ryan was violating community rules involving agricultural operations. Ryan almost smiled because the farm had been operating under the same agricultural use for years. Then he asked whether the HOA even had jurisdiction over the land. The sheriff asked Eleanor to provide the property documents showing that Ryan's farm was actually subject to the HOA's inspection authority. Eleanor searched through her folder again, but this time her confidence began to disappear. Ryan stood silently behind the lock gate, already realizing that her surprise inspection was about to become her biggest mistake. Eleanor finally pulled out an old HOA boundary map and handed it to Sheriff Davis. Ryan immediately recognized the map as outdated and pointed toward the actual property line. Davis compared the map with the physical boundary markers and noticed a discrepancy. Ryan explained that the HOA boundary ended several hundred feet before reaching his farm. Eleanor insisted that the map was still valid because the board had never formally changed it. The sheriff replied that an outdated map did not automatically change the actual property boundary. Eleanor became increasingly angry and told the deputies that Ryan was deliberately obstructing an HOA inspection. Ryan calmly replied that he had offered to cooperate if they could establish lawful authority. Sheriff Davis agreed that cooperation and trespassing were two very different things. One deputy noticed fresh bolt cutters lying near the gate. Ryan immediately said they had not been there when he arrived that morning. Everyone turned toward Eleanor, who suddenly stopped talking. Sheriff Davis asked Eleanor who brought the bolt cutters to the property. Eleanor claimed she had no idea where they came from. Ryan pointed toward the damaged chain on the gate and said someone had already tried to force it open. The sheriff asked whether anyone from the HOA had entered the property before the deputies arrived. Eleanor denied it and said the gate had already been damaged when she got there. Ryan shook his head and said the lock had been intact when he left for town. Ryan then remembered that his security cameras covered the entrance road and gate. He told Sheriff Davis that the footage could show exactly when the lock was damaged. For the first time, Eleanor looked genuinely worried. Ryan walked to a small monitor near the farmhouse and pulled up the morning footage. The video showed Eleanor's vehicles arriving before the deputies. It also showed someone approaching the lock gate carrying a pair of bolt cutters. The sheriff asked Ryan to replay the footage from the beginning. As the video played, everyone could see the gate being cut before the inspection team entered. Davis turned toward Eleanor and told her that this was no longer simply an HOA dispute. Eleanor insisted that she had never personally touched the lock. Sheriff Davis calmly told her that investigators would determine who actually cut it. Then Ryan quietly revealed that he had one more piece of information that would completely change the situation.